Traditionally, if you wanted to build some muscle, you'd lift some weights, and if you wanted to improve your flexibility, you'd do some stretching, and most of us would view these as two entirely separate goals requiring different approaches. But in recent years, more and more evidence emerges that these two things might be more closely related than once thought. If I told you that resistance training can improve your range of motion, you might not be surprised. But if I told you it can improve your range of motion as much as stretching, that's a bit more interesting, at least to me. And going the other way is even more surprising or less intuitive. Static stretching alone can actually build muscle and improve strength. So where we once thought lift equals build muscle and stretch equals get flexible, we're now at a point where it appears that both can do both. But to what extent, under what circumstances, and can you actually use any of this to develop a lifting routine and a stretching routine that complement each other? I think so, otherwise I wouldn't have made this video. Before we move on, I want to make it clear that I am aware of the difference between mobility and flexibility. I'm still just going to use the terms fairly interchangeably in this video, despite that being actual heresy, mainly because resistance training improves both flexibility and range of motion, which means it also improves mobility, but also because most of the time when normal people are talking about getting more flexible, they actually mean improving their mobility. You can always just assume that I'm talking broadly about becoming a more bendy human, you know what I mean? Just being able to get in mad shapes, create abstract silhouettes. Lifting for mobility. I want to start with two main points from a meta-analysis that looked at the combined results of 55 studies. First, resistance training was just as good as stretching at increasing range of motion, or at least the difference wasn't statistically significant. Second, combining resistance training and stretching didn't seem to improve range of motion any more than stretching alone. Now, these 2 points are important because they're going to inform how we approach building our routine later, so we'll come back to these. Stretching for gains. Again, a meta-analysis that this time looked at the combined results of 42 individual studies, and again, two main points. First, static stretching can fairly reliably improve strength and increase muscle size. Second, the effect seems both relatively small and dose dependent, meaning you might have to do a lot of stretching to get a small amount of gains. And when you start to look at some individual studies, you find a couple more potential limitations on how useful stretching might actually be for the purpose of muscle growth. One is that not all muscles or areas of the same muscle are affected equally. That's not ideal because for muscles that haven't been the subject of this research, which often focuses on calves or chest muscles, we don't really know if or how they'll be affected. Another is that quite often specialized equipment was needed to facilitate the stretches. Don't get me wrong, you can buy one of those weird foot things, but I mean, are you really going to strap that on every night and try and eke out some minor calf gains? It's definitely not the behavior of a well-adjusted, mentally sound member of society, is it? Don't really see how you could own one of those whilst simultaneously having friends. Anyway, no judgment, of course, just make sure you put it away before anyone comes over. All right, that's enough science for today. Let's just get to the real world application. This is what I think. First, the obvious. Resistance training is still the best way to build muscle, and stretching still the best way to get flexible. It is true that resistance training can improve your mobility and stretching can build muscle, but they aren't equally good at those things. Resistance training is a valid means of improving your mobility. It's quite effective, particularly if you're intentional about it, and it means that you can do so whilst getting all the other benefits of resistance training. Stretching is not really a valid means of gaining muscle for most people, with the exception being if you don't have access to a gym or injuries are preventing you from lifting and you do have a lot of spare time on your hands. In that case, it could be a viable way to make some modest gains, but for everyone else, it's just not practical or productive. And that's really because in the time it takes to build muscle via a stretching routine, you could have created a stronger muscle building stimulus by lifting weights and still made some quite good improvements to your flexibility. To give an oversimplified example, if you spend an hour lifting every day and you structure that workout well, which I'll come to, you'll build a lot of muscle and you'll make some really good flexibility improvements. If you spend an hour stretching every day, you'll make really good flexibility gains, still relatively little muscular gains, gains. Or to put it another way, You could replace some of your stretching with resistance training and still get similar flexibility improvements, which is what we'll try to do, but you probably couldn't replace some of your resistance training with stretching and get similar gains. So how best should you combine lifting and stretching if you want to make gains and get more flexible? Well, if you have infinite time, then the best approach is probably to continue to treat them as separate things because, as I said, resistance training is still the best way to build muscle and stretching is still the best way to improve your flexibility. For anyone else, I think the best approach is one that's movement specific. You see, I've just been talking quite generally so far in this video, but of course, you don't do a deadlift and expect to improve your shoulder mobility. When you're trying to improve your flexibility and/or mobility, then just as you would with building muscle, you need to approach each area individually. Let's just reiterate those earlier points. Resistance training can be just as effective at improving flexibility as stretching, and the combination of resistance training and stretching doesn't seem to provide greater flexibility improvements than stretching alone. And what this means when applied on a muscle-specific or movement-specific level is that you can use resistance training to improve your flexibility for certain areas. But then doubling down on that by focusing on those same specific areas in your flexibility routine might not be particularly beneficial because you're likely already getting most of the flexibility improvements from your lifting routine. So that probably isn't the best use of time. But why only certain areas? Why can't you depend solely on resistance training for mobility? Well, you could ask that in a slightly different way. If studies say resistance training is so good for flexibility, then you'd expect people who resistance train often to have good general mobility. Why isn't that always the case? And the answer is simply specificity. Any mobility improvements you get from your lifting routine will be specific to the movements you perform and the muscles and joints involved in those movements. But there are still lots of movements we don't do, and therefore lots of positions we never achieve via a typical resistance training program, either because we don't care about growing the muscles involved or because it's just impractical or inefficient to train them that way. This is why I think the best approach is to focus your resistance training routine and your flexibility routine primarily on different areas, reducing any overlap and therefore making the most of each. In other words, you try to get the most flexibility improvements possible from your lifting and then focus your stretching on the areas you can't adequately cover. Let me give you some examples, therefore, of how I go about prioritizing things. Take Romanian deadlifts. Since you're performing hip flexion mostly without spinal flexion, this is going to focus stretch predominantly on your hamstrings, and over time, if you do them regularly, they will improve your hamstring flexibility. So instead of performing stretches that mimic this movement, I might instead prioritize stretches that do involve lumbar flexion. That way, along with the hamstring stretch, I'm going to get a lower back stretch that I don't usually achieve through any of my lifts. Now, take something like the side splits. This is a pretty common flexibility goal, but this isn't one that's likely to be helped by resistance training simply because there aren't really many safe and practical exercises that take you into this position. The closest common thing is probably the adductor machine, which might have some carryover, but that involves hip flexion, so it's not really the same movement. So that is something that I'd focus more on in my flexibility routine. And another example like that of something that's not typically achieved through lifting is spinal rotation. So again, that's something that I'd give more attention to in a flexibility routine. Now, I'm sure it's becoming apparent that how well your lifting carries over into your flexibility improvements depends largely on your exercise selection. And that means it's important you choose exercises that allow for a progressive increase in range of motion. Let's say I'm doing some traditional split squats or some walking lunges. The depth I achieve is going to be limited by my knee hitting the floor, so there's an inbuilt limit on my range of motion. If I swap these for Bulgarian split squats, I can now stand my leading leg on a platform, which removes that limit and enables me to get as deep as my range of motion allows. And over time, if you do this, you will notice yourself being able to sink deeper and deeper into that squat. And you can make these adaptations for a lot of exercises. You can use smaller plates or stand on a platform for your RDLs. Even with something like a machine shoulder press, you can gradually increase the seat height. Now, to bring our split squat example back to this principle of not duplicating movements, since I'm now performing hip flexion with knee flexion on one limb whilst performing hip hyperextension on the other, I can probably afford to spend less time on stretches like this. Another thing I'd do where practical is choose higher reps. We know that provided we train to within a sufficient proximity to failure, we can make similar gains doing sets of 6 or sets of 15. So whilst higher reps will have the same effect on the muscle you build, I think in some instances they'll have a better effect on flexibility improvements. And mainly that's just because higher reps, which also means lighter weight, often encourages more controlled reps. People might feel more confident reaching the limits of their range of motion, and ultimately you'll spend longer total time in those stretched positions. And that brings me to an important caveat. We know that flexibility improvements are dose dependent, but we don't know how the dose of resistance training relates to the dose of stretching, i.e. how much lifting would we need to do to get similar flexibility improvements as, say, 30 minutes of stretching. We probably can't just do 3 sets of RDLs a week and say, right, that's my hamstring flexibility work done. And this is why I'm using terms like prioritize or focus on, because I don't think you could or should wholly omit any of the core stretches from your routine. I just think that you can do less of the ones that will benefit from your lifting routine to free up time for more of the ones that don't. Of course, your specific routine will depend both on how you prioritize building muscle versus getting more flexible. Do you care equally about those things, or one more than the other, as well as in which specific areas you care most about doing each of those things. And although I've been referring more to static stretching that would make up part of a flexibility routine, if we're going to be accurate, you'd likely also involve some more dynamic movements that make up an overall mobility routine. Anyway, in a world where each day is only 24 hours, I hope that helped you prioritize some stuff. Bye.
Joey Lenny is my hero.